All right, let's jump straight in. Antigen-antibody reactions. They form the absolute core of medical diagnostics. Since you already know the basic biochemistry of immune responses, we're skipping the fundamental biology today and jumping right into how these biomolecular associations are directly manipulated in the pathology lab. We're going to see exactly how these highly specific non-covalent interactions are harnessed for both qualitative and quantitative immunoassays. These are the tests you'll be ordering literally every single day on the wards. Here is a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll cover the antigen-antibody lattice hypothesis, precipitation versus agglutination methods, estimating antibodies using titer values, direct versus indirect agglutination, newer techniques utilizing labeled molecules, and we'll wrap up by comparing modern immunoassay labels.
Section 1, the antigen-antibody lattice hypothesis.
So according to Marrack's lattice hypothesis, a visible antigen-antibody reaction, like macroscopic clumping or precipitation, is basically going to fail if the numbers of antigens and antibodies are disproportionate. The crucial takeaway here, you only get a strong, visible reaction when those binding sites are optimally balanced. We call this the zone of equivalence, and it's where the multivalent antibodies cross-link perfectly with antigens to form a massive visible network.
And this perfectly illustrates why you might actually get a false negative on a lab report. Think about a situation with way too many antibodies, known as a prozone. That completely inhibits lattice enlargement. Because the valencies of the antigen are fully satisfied right away, zero cross-linking occurs. It's a super common clinical pitfall in serology. If you suspect a prozone phenomenon is causing a false negative, the lab has to systematically dilute the patient's serum to reduce that antibody concentration and push the reaction right into that beautiful middle sweet spot, the zone of equivalence. Conversely, if you have antigen excess, the postzone, that also fails to form a proper lattice.
Moving right along to Section 2, precipitation versus agglutination methods.
This is a classic high-yield comparison for your exams and clinical rotations. Precipitation involves soluble antigens reacting with antibodies to form insoluble precipitate bands, or sometimes suspended floccules. Think of the VDRL or RPR tests used for diagnosing syphilis. Agglutination, on the other hand, involves particulate or completely insoluble antigens, forming distinct visible clumps. The big thing to remember is that agglutination is significantly more sensitive than precipitation, making it incredibly valuable for rapid diagnostics.
Agglutination stands out so clearly to the naked eye, making interpretation rapid and straightforward. A negative milky white suspension will remain completely uniform, whereas a positive result shows distinct clumping with an obvious clearing of the suspension fluid. You'll see this exact phenomenon when serotyping bacterial colonies grown in culture or when you're doing routine blood grouping and cross-matching.
Section 3. Estimating antibodies using titer values.
Let's look at how tube agglutination actually builds a quantitative profile by systematically diluting the patient's serum against a fixed antigen. This is standard procedure. We start with the patient's serum and progressively dilute it, 1 to 2, 1 to 4, 1 to 8, and so on. We then add the exact same amount of antigen to every single tube. We wait and then visually inspect to find the very last tube in the sequence that still exhibits a clear clumping reaction. That final endpoint gives us our titer. By definition, the titer is the highest dilution of the patient's serum that still produces a visibly positive agglutination reaction. This is a critical clinical value because it distinguishes between true negative and false negative results, providing exact antibody estimation. For example, in the Weidel test for enteric fever, tracking a rising titer over a few weeks is an absolute diagnostic hallmark. Next up, Section 4, direct versus indirect agglutination. While direct agglutination involves the native antigen interacting directly with the antibody, which is fantastic when your antigen is already on a large particle like a red blood cell, indirect methods cleverly hijack carrier molecules to amplify the visible effect. In indirect or passive agglutination, we take soluble antigens that would normally just form weak precipitates, and we literally coat them onto larger carrier molecules, like red blood cells or synthetic polystyrene latex particles. This is exactly why the latex agglutination test is so wildly popular for detecting things like ASO antibodies or rheumatoid factor. Those polystyrene particles create a remarkably clear, visible clump on a dark card in minutes. The high contrast between the bright white latex clumps and the black background removes all the ambiguity of reading the test. It's point-of-care testing at its finest, giving you immediate clinical insights without needing heavy lab equipment.
Let's shift gears to Section 5, newer techniques using labeled molecules.
To bypass the limitations of visual clumping, modern medicine just attaches highly visible labels right onto the molecular complex. By binding an enzyme, a fluorophore, or an isotope to our target, we completely remove the need for a massive lattice to form before we can detect a reaction. This pushes our detection thresholds incredibly low, which allows us to identify infections or biomarkers at the absolute earliest stages of disease. In a direct immunofluorescence assay, replacing an enzyme with a fluorescent dye allows us to directly light up cellular surface antigens under a UV microscope. The antibody, which is conjugated with a fluorescent label, binds directly to the antigen on a tissue smear. We wash away the unbound antibodies, hit the slide with specific wavelengths of light, and the targets brilliantly fluoresce. You'll see this routinely used for detecting autoantibodies like ANA and lupus, or identifying viral antigens right in tissue samples. Taking it a step further, chemiluminescence uses a luxogenic chemical reaction to emit photons directly. Guys, this makes it 10 times more sensitive than a standard ELISA. Instead of measuring a color change, the enzyme acts on a chemoluminescent substrate, like luminol, producing actual light that gets captured by a highly sensitive luminometer. And because there is absolutely no background light emission in biological samples, your signal-to-noise ratio is completely pristine.
Let's wrap things up with Section 6, comparing modern immunoassay labels.
If you want the ultimate clinical cheat sheet, here it is. Whether it's color changes in ELISA, beta radiation in RIA, or photon emission in CLIA, the core difference always comes down to the detector molecule and the resulting signal. The fundamental antigen-antibody binding mechanics, those remain identical across the board. What changes is the engineering of the label to maximize sensitivity and automate the reading process in massive clinical chemistry analyzers. Understanding this breakdown ensures you know exactly the physical principles behind every quantitative biomarker you order.
So, as we move from observing simple macroscopic floccules to counting individual photons emitted by chemoluminescent enzymes, it really begs the question, how much closer can we get to detecting a single molecule of disease? The progression from benchtop agglutination cards to automated luminescent analyzers represents a relentless drive toward absolute molecular precision. Keep these mechanisms in mind the next time you review a lab panel. Understanding diagnostic constraints, like the Prozone effect or the sensitivity of a label, is exactly what separates a good clinician from a great one.